In a scorched Nevada auction yard, packed with wrecked exotics, the crowd laughed when a young single father paid $1,500 for a McLaren so mangled it barely resembled a car. The nose was compressed into folded carbon and fractured aluminum. The VIN plate had been scratched down to bare metal. The engine had seized from an oil fire. Every dealer called it expensive scrap. But when the young man crouched low and studied one small detail buried beneath the burned carbon frame, his expression shifted entirely because this car had never been allowed to exist publicly. If you enjoy a story where the truth refuses to stay buried, stay until the end, because what this man found inside that wreck changed everything. Hunter Walker had spent his 27th year learning how to survive quietly. He stood 6 feet 2, broad across the shoulders, with close-cropped brown hair and a face that might have been handsome if exhaustion had not settled into the lines around his eyes. He worked 6 days a week at a restoration garage on the western edge of Phoenix, Arizona, turning wrenches on tired European sedans for wages that barely cleared the rent on a 2-bedroom house he shared with his 6-year-old daughter, Madison. The garage smelled of solvent and old rubber, and his hands were perpetually stained with grease no amount of scrubbing fully removed. He arrived early, left late, said almost nothing about himself to the other mechanics, and carried a small blue inhaler in the breast pocket of his work jacket because Madison had mild asthma and he had learned to keep one within reach at all times. His coworkers knew he was good with composite materials better than anyone else in the shop and that he had lived in England for a time, but beyond that, he was simply the quiet guy who fixed things correctly on the first attempt. Madison was small for her age, with dark brown eyes that missed nothing and a habit of dragging a worn picture book about racing cars to the dinner table. She had one photograph she considered precious, her father at what appeared to be a professional motorsport facility somewhere in England, standing beside a covered shape that had the unmistakable low profile of a performance car. She did not know exactly what the car was, only that her father looked different in that photo, younger, lighter somehow, as if a weight he now carried had not yet been placed on him. She kept the photo in a plastic sleeve inside her backpack and occasionally asked him about it. Hunter would look at the picture for a moment, say something neutral, and change the subject. He lived with a locked metal box on the shelf above his workbench at home. Inside it were 3 things: a McLaren engineering badge from a facility that no longer officially existed, several hand-drawn aerodynamic sketches rendered on graph paper in the precise notation of someone trained in stress analysis, and a photograph of a chassis under a gray tarpaulin being moved through a loading bay at night. He had never shown those items to anyone. On certain nights after Madison had fallen asleep, he would open the box, look at the contents for a minute or two, close it again, and go back to whatever repair job he had brought home. The other mechanics at the garage assumed he had been a technician somewhere in Europe. They were not wrong. They were simply missing the part of the story that would have changed how they looked at him entirely. The auction took place on a Thursday in early October at an impound and salvage yard outside Henderson, Nevada. An insurance company was liquidating a large lot of total loss exotics, Ferraris with crushed rooflines, a Lamborghini that had met a concrete barrier at highway speed, 2 Porsches that had been recovered from a flooding event in California. The lot had drawn a crowd of dealers, flippers, and parts brokers who worked the salvage circuit from Las Vegas to Los Angeles. Hunter had driven up from Phoenix the night before in his old pickup, slept 4 hours in a motel off the highway, and arrived at the yard before the gates opened. He had seen the lot listing online 3 days earlier. One line item had made him set his coffee down and read it a second time. Evelyn Carter arrived in a black SUV with tinted windows and stepped out looking like someone who had never purchased anything at a salvage auction in her life. She was 26, with sharp cheekbones and dark eyes behind rimless glasses, dressed in a tailored coat over a knit turtleneck despite the Nevada heat. She ran a boutique investment fund that specialized in rare and historically significant automobiles, the kind of fund where a phone call could move several $1 million in a single afternoon. She had brought 2 specialists with her, one who assessed structural damage, one who authenticated provenance. They moved through the lot methodically, photographing and dismissing. Evelyn herself said very little, pointed occasionally, and typed notes into a small leather-bound device she carried everywhere. She noticed Hunter Walker the way you notice background furniture briefly, without interest, and then not at all. The McLaren was brought out near midday, pushed on a rolling dolly because it had no wheels capable of bearing weight. What remained of it was staggering in its destruction. The front of the car had been driven backward through itself in a high-speed impact, compressing the nose structure into something that looked more like a crushed beverage can than an engineered machine. There was no windscreen, no doors, no interior beyond a carbonized skeleton of a seat and the melted remnants of a steering column. The carbon fiber panels along the flanks had burned to a matte gray and in places had delaminated in large curling sheets. The VIN stamp on the chassis rail had been abraded away deliberately. It looked like, though you could argue a violent fire had done the same work. Dealers circled it the way men circle something dead in the road, curious, amused, keeping a comfortable distance. A heavy-set broker in a Stetson said it was only worth pulling for the uprights if they were titanium. Another dealer, leaning on a post with his arms crossed, said the carbon was too far gone for anything useful. Someone from the back called out that you could not give that car away in that condition. The auctioneer started the bidding at $500 as a formality. It crept to $800, stalled at $1,000, and crawled to $1,200 before the room went essentially quiet. Hunter had not yet spoken. He had been crouching beside the wreck for nearly 4 minutes, moving around it slowly, his head tilted at angles that looked almost liturgical to anyone watching. He had looked at the weave pattern in the surviving carbon panels. He had noted where the intake was positioned relative to the monocoque centerline. He had traced with one finger the geometry of the rear subframe where it met the tub. When the bidding stopped at $1,200, he straightened up and said, quietly, $1,500. The laughter was immediate and genuine. A man near the front made a comment about throwing money at firewood. Evelyn Carter looked across the yard at Hunter with an expression of pure, unhurried assessment, the look of someone calculating whether a person is delusional or simply uninformed, and then said, with a dry precision that carried across the yard, that he had just bought the most expensive piece of trash in the lot. Hunter did not respond. He was watching the dolly as it was wheeled past him toward the holding area, and when the wreck rolled by at arm's length, he saw it, barely visible beneath the outermost layer of carbonized fiber, in a location that would mean nothing to anyone who had not spent years working inside a very specific facility in Woking, England, was a stenciled alphanumeric code. 2 letters and 2 numbers. XP17. His pulse accelerated in a way it had not in years. There is a particular kind of memory that does not live in the mind the way ordinary recollections do. It lives somewhere in the nervous system, encoded in the body alongside the motions and habits of work done intensively for a significant period of life. Hunter Walker had been 22 years old when he joined McLaren's composite development team as a junior technician, fresh from a vocational engineering program in Bristol. He had been recruited for his exceptional spatial reasoning and his already unusual understanding of carbon fiber behavior under thermal and mechanical stress. The facility where he worked was not the public-facing factory in Woking that appeared in magazine profiles. It was a smaller site, access-controlled and deliberately anonymous from the outside, where a team of roughly 30 engineers worked on development programs that were not discussed with the press, with shareholders, or in most cases with anyone outside the immediate project team. The program Hunter was assigned to had no commercial name. Internally it was called XP17, a designation that placed it in a lineage of experimental chassis platforms that McLaren had explored quietly for years. The objective was a hypercar that pushed beyond the P1 in specific measurable ways: lighter overall mass, a revised hybrid architecture that reduced the thermal load on the battery pack during sustained performance driving, and a monocoque tub built using layering techniques that the composites team, including Hunter, had developed over the preceding 2 years. The car was never meant to go into production in the near term. It was a proof of concept for technologies that might eventually migrate into a commercial platform 5 or 7 years later. 2 complete chassis had been constructed. Hunter had worked on both of them, running stress analysis on the tub sections and the suspension pickup points, logging data in spreadsheets that he was required to store only on the facility's internal servers and never transport outside the building. The program ended abruptly in the aftermath of a test accident that occurred at a private circuit in the south of England during a night run. The details of the accident were tightly controlled by the company's legal and communications teams. What Hunter and his colleagues were told was minimal. The test vehicle had sustained critical damage, the program was being suspended pending review, and their assignments were being restructured. Within 8 weeks, Hunter's contract had not been renewed. He was given no specific reason beyond a restructuring of the composites department. His UK work authorization lapsed shortly afterward because it had been tied to the employment. He had been seeing a woman named Claire, who became pregnant and who had always said she would not raise a child outside the UK if Hunter could not secure stable residency. When Madison was 3 months old and Hunter was back in the United States with no job, no visa, and no clear path forward, Claire stopped returning his calls. He had been living in Phoenix for 4 years now, and on the nights he thought about England at all, it was not with bitterness. It was with the specific heaviness of a person who once stood close to something extraordinary and then watched the door close in front of them without ever fully understanding why. He stood in the garage he rented on weekends for personal projects, a narrow unit in a shared industrial space near Tempe, and looked at the McLaren wreck on his rented dolly in the center of the floor, and he said quietly to no one at all, "There is no way you are still here." The first phase of disassembly took 2 weekends. Hunter worked methodically, removing the burned and delaminated outer carbon panels with the care of someone handling archaeological material rather than industrial waste. Beneath the destruction was structure. The inner tub, protected from the worst of the fire by the outer skin, retained enough integrity to read. Hunter had brought his old composite analysis tools from storage, a fiber optic inspection scope, portable UV light array, and a laptop running a CAD program he had used professionally nearly 5 years before. What he found under the burned exterior confirmed what his body had already understood the moment he saw the weave pattern at the auction. The subframe geometry was wrong for any production McLaren. Wrong meaning, it had never appeared in any production McLaren. The titanium lattice inserts at the rear suspension pickup points used a fabrication method that McLaren had developed internally and never licensed or disclosed externally. The mounting geometry of the cooling architecture in the engine bay, substantially destroyed though it was, followed a layout that existed in none of the service documentation for any car the company had ever sold to the public. When Hunter brought his findings to the other mechanics at his regular garage, their response was exactly what he had expected and feared simultaneously. The senior tech, a decent man named Ray who had been fixing European cars for 30 years and prided himself on calling things straight, told Hunter without cruelty that prototype McLarens did not surface at Nevada insurance auctions for $1,500, and that if this were genuinely a factory development vehicle, the manufacturer would have recovered it long before it reached an auction lot. A younger mechanic said it more bluntly, "Hunter, you bought a burned McLaren and you're telling yourself a story." Hunter did not argue. He went back to work. Evelyn Carter came to the industrial complex 2 weeks after the auction to pick up a set of Porsche control arms she had purchased from another lot in the same auction. She found Hunter in his unit when she walked past the open bay door, and she stopped. He had the McLaren's rear subframe inverted on a workbench and was photographing individual welds under a magnifying light. Evelyn stood in the doorway for a moment, looked at the remains of the car, looked at Hunter, and said with something that was not quite contempt but lived in that general neighborhood that he was attempting to turn garbage into a lottery ticket. Hunter looked up at her briefly, said nothing, and returned to photographing the weld. She watched him for another 10 seconds. Then she left. Madison had started sitting in the garage on Saturday afternoons, doing her reading assignments on a folding chair with a cup of juice while her father worked. She had asked twice now what the car was and why it was important, and Hunter had told her the simplest version he could construct, that he thought the car might be something very rare, something nobody else had recognized. The second time she asked, she had looked at him with her dark, serious eyes and said, "Daddy, if the car is really special, what happens?" And Hunter had looked at her for a moment before answering. He said, "Then maybe this is our last good chance at something." He said it quietly and he did not explain further, and Madison nodded as if she understood more than he had said, which in certain ways she did. Hunter spent 3 weeks on the serial number problem. The XP17 identifier he had spotted under the carbon at the auction was a surface marking significant, but not irrefutable on its own. What he needed was the laser-embedded chassis serial that McLaren's Advanced Technologies division had used on both XP17 chassis, etched into the tub structure at a depth visible only under UV examination of the raw fiber, techniques so labor-intensive that it had been applied to fewer than a dozen vehicles ever constructed at that facility. The fire and impact damage had compromised large sections of the tub surface, and the serial was not intact. He could read fragments. He could read enough to know it was there. but the full sequence required reconstruction. He spent evenings at the kitchen table after Madison was asleep, working through carbon fiber diffraction patterns on his laptop, correlating what the UV scanner showed against what he remembered of the documentation format from his time in Woking. He was going on memory, on professional instinct, and on the physical evidence in front of him, and the combination was telling him clearly what his rational mind kept trying to modulate with caution. Meanwhile, the rent for the industrial unit was 30 days behind. Madison's prescription had gone up in cost since the summer, and he had been stretching her refills further than was medically ideal. The garage owner had left a note on the door asking when the wreck was being moved. Hunter looked at the note, folded it, put it in his pocket, and went back to work on the tub. He had reached out to 6 people from his time in the composites industry in England. 5 had not responded at all. 1, an older structural engineer named George Calloway, who had worked at the Advanced Development Facility before Hunter had arrived, and who had since retired to a village in Shropshire, replied to his email at 11 the following morning. Hunter sent him a carefully curated set of photographs, nothing that identified the car's location or his own name, just the structural details, the weave patterns, the partial serial fragments, the titanium lattice work. Then he went to sleep. His phone rang at 12:40 in the morning. The screen showed a UK number he recognized. He answered. George Calloway's face appeared on the video call against the background of a dark living room, and the man looked as though he had aged 5 years since Hunter last saw him. His face had gone the color of old paper. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, "Hunter, where did you find it?" The answer George provided over the next 40 minutes recontextualized everything Hunter thought he understood about the XP-17 program and its end. The car had not simply been a development casualty. Its cancellation had been architected. George had not been a junior technician when the program ended. He had been the senior structures lead, and he had been present in meetings that Hunter had never attended, meetings where the decision to terminate the program had been presented as an engineering and budget judgment, but where the real pressure had come from outside the company. A private investment consortium that had provided development capital for the program had, over the course of 18 months, shifted its position on the technology. The battery cooling architecture that the XP-17 team had developed was, by the time the program ended, roughly a decade ahead of what any competing manufacturer was deploying. That technology had enormous value not as part of a McLaren hypercar, but as licensable intellectual property that could be extracted and sold separately if the original program ceased to exist. The accident had been real, but the response to the accident, the speed with which the program was wound down, the comprehensiveness with which all records were scrubbed from accessible databases, the manner in which the composites team was dispersed and their contracts quietly discontinued that had been managed. George had signed an NDA so broad and so specifically punitive that he had never spoken about any of this to anyone. He was speaking now, at nearly 1 in the morning British time, because Hunter had sent him a photograph of a piece of metal that was supposed to have been destroyed. One of the 2 XP-17 chassis had been demolished at the facility. That was documented. The second, the one that had survived the night test accident with less damage than was officially recorded, had been loaded into a shipping container in the port of Southampton under a manifest description that listed it as damaged automotive tooling being returned to a supplier in the United States. The container had reached the port of Los Angeles and had then been loaded onto a truck for inland transport. Somewhere in Nevada, the truck had been involved in a collision. The container had been seized by the insurance company handling the freight claim. After that, George did not know. He had assumed the car was gone. He had lived with that assumption for 4.5 years. Hunter sat in his dark garage at 1:15 in the morning, phone in hand, looking at the wreck on the dolly, and he understood now that the company behind the investment consortium that had terminated the XP-17 program, the parent company that had applied pressure, extracted the technology, and ensured no one talked, was the same entity that, under a different corporate name, had seeded the automotive investment fund that Evelyn Carter currently ran. He had been cautious about this connection when he first identified it, because it seemed like the kind of coincidence that a person under stress invents to make a narrative feel coherent. But the corporate lineage was there in the public filings if you knew what you were looking at and knew the right original company names to trace forward through a series of acquisitions and restructurings. Evelyn had begun her own internal investigation 2 days after her second visit to Hunter's garage. She had gone back to her office and pulled the oldest accessible files on the fund's parent company, documents from before her tenure, before she had been brought in to run the automotive portfolio as a 23-year-old who had been considered prodigiously capable and politically unthreatening. What she found, or rather what she found was missing, troubled her considerably. References to something called the XP Development Initiative appeared in budget records from the relevant period, always in a category labeled Terminated Programs, always cross-referenced to a legal hold file that was no longer accessible under her clearance level. The name XP17 did not appear anywhere in the current database. It had been removed with the kind of specificity that required deliberate action rather than routine archiving. She did not contact Hunter immediately. She needed to understand what she was standing inside before she decided how to move. But she was no longer certain he was delusional, and that uncertainty changed everything about how she was thinking. 3 days later, Hunter arrived at his garage unit at 7 in the morning and found the door standing open. The padlock had been sheared. Inside, the rear section of the McLaren had been moved from where he had left it, not by much, but enough to know someone had searched it. The portable hard drive that contained his UV scans and the reconstructed serial fragments was gone from the shelf where he kept his laptop case. He stood in the doorway for a full minute before he went inside and began assessing what remained. The tools were still there. The tub was still there. The most critical physical evidence, the titanium lattice inserts and the monocoque panels with the embedded serial, had not been taken, possibly because whoever entered had not known precisely what to look for. He called Madison's school to make sure she had arrived. He drove there anyway and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes watching the entrance before he allowed himself to feel anything other than immediately practical. That evening, when he picked her up and they drove home, Madison showed him that she had his old tablet, the one he used mostly for streaming, the one he had not thought about since she had borrowed it 2 weeks ago to watch a cartoon series in the car. She had it in her backpack. She had taken it home from the garage the previous Saturday and forgotten to return it. On it, in the photo backup folder that auto-synced from his scanner, was a complete copy of every UV scan he had run before the hard drive was taken. He held her for a long time without explaining why. She did not ask. That same evening, working on the tablet with the backed-up scan data restored to his laptop, Hunter located something he had not had the resolution to identify from the damaged portions of the old scans. In the files pulled from the autosync, one of the UV images showed a secondary marking on the inner face of the tub, a marking that was not a serial number but a production sequence identifier, stamped at the assembly stage. It was partial, but it was sufficient. Cross-referenced against George Calloway's description of the 2 chassis build sequence, it placed this car unambiguously as the second of the 2 XP17 chassis. The one that had left England. The one that had been in the container. The one that was officially nowhere. He had also, in reviewing files he had kept from his personal work sessions at the facility years ago, backed up to a cloud drive he had nearly forgotten about, found a short video clip. It had been recorded informally by a colleague during a day test session and had migrated into a group chat that Hunter had screenshotted and archived without particular thought at the time. The clip was 47 seconds long. It showed a low-profile prototype car moving through a high-speed corner on a private circuit, and what was visible in the clip was extraordinary even to someone unfamiliar with the engineering. The aerodynamic bodywork was visibly adjusting its profile as the car cornered, the active aero system responding in real time in a way that no production car had approached at the time of filming. More importantly, for Hunter's purposes, the clip was long enough that the chassis code stenciled on the driver's doorsill appeared in frame for approximately 4 seconds. It matched the partial serial on the tub. Evelyn came to him, not as a representative of the fund, not with specialists or legal counsel. She came alone, in ordinary clothes, at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday night, and knocked on the door of the industrial unit. Hunter let her in without a great deal of ceremony. She looked at the car, which, at this stage had been partially disassembled to the point where its true architecture was visible to anyone who knew what they were seeing. She looked at the workbench with Hunter's documentation spread across it. Then she looked at him and said something that visibly cost her a degree of effort. She said she thought he was right. Hunter regarded her for a moment and then asked her what she intended to do about it. She said she needed more time. He said he wasn't sure he had it. A legal letter had arrived at the garage 3 days before from a firm he had never heard of, demanding that he surrender the vehicle on the grounds that it constituted improperly held proprietary industrial property. He had not yet responded to the letter. What followed over the next 3 weeks constituted the most consequential collaboration of both their careers. Evelyn used her access credentials to retrieve archived shipping documents from a period well before her tenure at the fund. The container manifest from Southampton was there, buried inside a freight record linked to a defunct subsidiary that had been absorbed into the parent company 7 years prior. It documented a shipment of automotive development tooling to a logistics facility in Nevada. The consignment note bore an internal reference number that, when cross-checked against George Calloway's recollection and the partial chassis identifiers Hunter had reconstructed, traced directly to the XP-17. The car had been shipped. It had been in a container that was reported lost in a freight collision in Nevada. It had subsequently been misidentified, impounded, and eventually folded into an insurance auction lot 3 years later under the description damaged exotic vehicle, manufacturer unverified. The legal pressure intensified. Hunter noticed a dark-colored SUV parked down the street from his house on 4 separate mornings. He changed the route he drove Madison to school. He moved the most critical physical components of the car to a locked storage unit under a name he borrowed with permission from Ray at the garage. Madison, who was too perceptive for her age, asked him one evening while they were eating dinner whether the men in the big car were going to take his McLaren. He told her they were not going to take it. She looked at her plate for a moment and then asked whether he was sure. He said he was working on being sure, which was honest, and she accepted that. The independent verification session was held at a private facility near Monterey, California, in early December. Evelyn's network had assembled the attendees, 3 independent automotive historians and appraisers, 2 engineers with documented McLaren development backgrounds from separate eras, a correspondent from a respected automotive press publication, and 4 representatives from significant collecting and investment institutions. Hunter drove down the night before with Madison asleep across the back seat and the most critical components of the car secured in the truck bed under a locked cover. He had not slept more than 5 hours on any night in the preceding 2 weeks. The room contained enough expertise and enough skepticism to make the presentation genuinely challenging. The car's physical condition invited doubt before Hunter said a single word. He presented systematically and without drama the monocoque tub geometry, the carbon weave specification and its departure from any known production variant, the reconstructed laser serial and its correlation with the second XP-17 chassis in the build sequence, the titanium lattice fabrication method and its provenance in McLaren's internal development documentation, the video clip with the matching chassis identifier. He spoke in the register of someone giving a technical debrief, precise, unembellished, citing his sources. When he finished the presentation, he asked for a moment and reached underneath the driver's side of the tub. He had found the panel 3 weeks earlier. It was a removable access cover, roughly the size of a hardback book, bonded with a titanium fastener system to the lower lateral face of the tub in a location that would have been inaccessible without substantial disassembly. It had survived the fire and the impact in reasonable condition because of its location within the protected interior geometry of the monocoque. Behind it, secured to the inner face of the panel with 2 small bolts, was a plaque of machined titanium approximately 12 centimeters wide and 6 centimeters tall. On it, engraved with what was clearly hand-applied tooling, were the following characters: XP-17 experimental prototype, followed by a 2-digit number indicating the build sequence, followed by a McLaren internal facility code that George Calloway had confirmed matched the advanced development site in its final operational configuration. The room stayed quiet for several seconds. Then it did not. A former director of technical programs at McLaren, a man named Edmund Carver who had retired in his late 50s and now consulted for collecting institutions, confirmed from across the room that the plaque format and the facility code were consistent with documentation practice he had personally overseen. He then said, with the careful diction of a man choosing words that would be repeated, "This car was never authorized for public disclosure." That was all he said on the topic. It was enough. The press coverage began the same evening, driven by the automotive correspondent who had been present and who filed her story within 3 hours of the session ending. By the following morning, the story had propagated across every major automotive publication in the English-speaking world. The framing varied in emphasis but not in substance. A lost McLaren development prototype, built to technology specifications years ahead of its commercial contemporaries, had been found in a Nevada salvage auction lot by a former composite technician who had worked on its construction and paid $1,500 for it. The parent company's offer arrived via their legal firm within 72 hours of the press coverage. It was comprehensive and it was large. It involved the transfer of the vehicle along with all documentation and data Hunter had compiled, a permanent non-disclosure agreement covering all aspects of the XP17 program, and a financial settlement that would have changed the material circumstances of Hunter's life in a fundamental and permanent way. He read the offer in his kitchen at the table where Madison did her homework, and he sat with it for a long time. Evelyn came to see him the following day. She sat across the table in his kitchen and told him something she had not said directly before, that she had arrived at the Nevada auction assuming she was in a world she understood completely, and that everything she had assumed about who was competent and who was not, about which judgments were sound and which were wishful thinking, had been wrong in the specific case of Hunter Walker. She said she had spent her career learning to identify value and that she had looked at him and seen a man she found easy to dismiss, and that this had been a failure of perception on her part rather than a judgment his actual conduct had warranted. Hunter listened to this and then asked if she was going to sign the NDA. She said no. Madison had fallen asleep that evening across her father's lap on the couch in the workshop, her book face down beside her and her breathing quiet and even. Hunter sat in the low light with his hand resting on his daughter's shoulder, and he thought about the locked box on the shelf, the badge, the sketches, the photograph of the prototype under its tarpaulin. He thought about what it had meant to him to carry those things for 4 years without being able to explain to anyone why he still kept them. He thought about what it would mean to accept the offer, deposit the money, and watch the story disappear behind another set of sealed files. The alternative was less straightforward and considerably less certain. He thought about Madison asking him if the car was really special. He thought about what he had told her. Then he picked up the letter and looked at it for a final time, and he set it face down on the workbench. He declined the non-disclosure agreement. He engaged an attorney, a woman in Scottsdale who handled intellectual property litigation and who had read the news coverage and called him unsolicited, and structured a counter-proposal. The physical car and its documentation would be transferred to a nonprofit automotive heritage trust in exchange for display rights and a compensation that covered his legal fees and a portion of his losses from the previous years. The full history of the XP17 program, including the circumstances of its cancellation, would be disclosed publicly. The technology itself, the battery cooling architecture, the active aerodynamic system was by this point 5 years into a patent cycle under the parent company's portfolio, and the legal complexities of that aspect would take years to fully resolve. But the story would not be buried. 1 year later, the XP17 sat behind a curved panel of museum glass in a purpose-built gallery space attached to a California Automotive Heritage Foundation. It had been partially restored to a condition that displayed its architecture clearly, the monocoque tub exposed along one flank, the titanium lattice work visible under accent lighting, the titanium plaque mounted on a small stand beside the car. The card beside the display gave the car's designation, its build year, its design intent, and a brief account of how it had moved from a factory in England to a salvage lot in Nevada to a museum in California. Hunter ran his own shop now, a proper, small but respected, that specialized in the restoration and conservation of historically significant performance vehicles. He had been approached by 2 other institutions about projects involving undocumented or misattributed exotics, and he had taken one of them. He had spoken twice at engineering events, once on composite stress analysis and historic restoration, and once on the provenance and authentication of experimental prototypes. He did not enjoy public speaking particularly, but he was good at it in the way that people who have spent years communicating only essential information tend to be good at it. Evelyn had separated formally from the parent investment company within 4 months of the Nevada story breaking, citing a conflict between the fund's legacy decisions and her ability to operate with professional integrity. She had subsequently partnered with Hunter on a small automotive heritage fund of their own, one focused on identifying and preserving vehicles that existed outside the mainstream record. On a Saturday afternoon in October, exactly 13 months after the auction, Hunter brought Madison to the museum. She was 7 now, with her father's observational stillness and her own already forming opinions about everything she encountered. They stood together in front of the display case. The car still looked like something that had been through catastrophic damage, because it had, and the restoration had been honest rather than cosmetic. Madison stood with her hands clasped in front of her and looked at it for a long time. Then she turned and looked up at Hunter and asked, "Daddy, did they finally believe you?" He looked at the car that had arrived at an auction as an anonymous pile of burned aluminum and carbonized fiber, that had carried its identity in layers too deep for most people to bother reaching, that had waited without any option but patience for someone to come along with the right kind of knowledge and the right kind of stubbornness. He put his hand on Madison's shoulder and said, "It doesn't really matter when they believed it. What matters is that I didn't stop." She considered this. She looked back at the car. She appeared to be filing the answer somewhere for later use, in the way that children store things they know they will need again in a different version of the same question further down the years. Hunter stood beside her in the quiet gallery and did not say anything more, because there was nothing more that needed to be said. Sometimes the thing the whole world calls a pile of scrap is simply waiting for the one person patient enough, stubborn enough, and experienced enough to read what it is actually saying. And sometimes that person has been carrying the answer in a locked metal box for 4 years, waiting for the question to find them again.
Welcome in, guys. How's everyone's day going? What a great game. I'm excited to play this again. Alrighty. That's a gang. Okay, you went that way. We'll go this way. Oh, wait. Nothing else in here? We're done in here, right? That's it? No bosses? Alright. Now what do? What do y'all think? Keep going this way, I'm guessing. Just gotta keep my eyes open. Could go straight, which I think I went the first time.